Hello everybody, welcome back to The Contrarian. For those of you who might be new to this channel, my name is Logan. I like to talk about the markets and investing, and most of all talking about narratives and news out there that really tends to not make it to the front of the headlines, but that I think is very important nonetheless. And one thing going on right now, and that has been going on for a while, but that I really do think is worth talking about, is the major disruption to the global food supply chain that is currently going on and that has been going on for a while now, but that I think is going to get significantly worse for several reasons, and several reasons that haven't improved, and if anything are just about to get very much worse in a big way. And I'm sure we've all, or a lot of us have heard about the recent fire in the fertilizer manufacturer in North Carolina in the United States. But this is just kind of a recent example of a longer term trend that I can hopefully show us that has been going on for the last year, and that I don't think is heading in a positive direction, and that in my opinion will likely cause food prices to be a major contributor to higher inflation in the coming year. And I've been calling for higher inflation for a while now, and it was somewhat of a controversial, or somewhat of a more questionable stance a few months ago, mainly because I think people at that time were thinking that the supply chains would be able to improve from where they were. You know, they would be able to be more easily resolved. And yes, the supply chains have been the predominant reason for why inflation and producer inflation and consumer inflation have both been at 40-year highs, and they've basically been the major reason for why inflation has been so rampant in the last year and a half or so. Has simply been just the major disruption that the pandemic caused the global supply chains of shutting everything down and then having to restart everything. And then obviously, with it being such a complicated system as was in place before the pandemic, it just really was not possible to get everything functioning again after the pandemic as it was prior to the pandemic. And if anything, there's a lot more issues coming to the surface even now, about 2 years out from the beginning of COVID, that are just now beginning to surface. One of them, the major contributor, being just the massive increase in fertilizer prices that are still continuing to go up, and which is just continuing to worsen the problem that farmers are experiencing, with some farmers already just not being able to grow certain crops out there, particularly crops which require larger amounts of fertilizer, such as corn. And this is just really not good for a lot of reasons. But without further ado, I'll just dive into some helpful stats and articles out there that I found. So first of all, looking back just at 2021, just to get an idea of where we have been, the level of the food price inflation varies depending on whether the food was purchased at home, so whether you're making home-cooked meals or whether you're going to a restaurant, but basically it came out to about the same, of food at restaurants being about a 6% higher in 2021, and then the food at home actually being a little higher than that, of 6.5% higher in 2021 as well. So that's looking back at the prior year. But now looking forward, currently farms are failing. I found a really helpful article out there just recently released, and this is mainly talking about farmers in the developing world, but this is also very true for farmers in the developed world as well, although probably not as bad. But it just kind of is showing the increased shortage of food that is also resulting as fertilizer prices are massively breaking out from here. So essentially what is currently going on is there is a massive shortage of fertilizer. So it talks about different farmers in the developing world essentially deciding that they are no longer going to be able to produce certain crops, or that they're having to produce a fraction of a crop such as coffee or whatever they might be. And farmers in the US are also feeling the pinch, with some shifting to their other planting plans. The impact is expected to be worse in developing countries where small holders have limited access to bank loans and cannot pay for upfront expensive fertilizers. Fertilizer demand in sub-Saharan Africa could fall 30% in 2022. According to the International Fertilizer Development Center, that would translate to 30 million metric tons of less food being produced, which the center says is equivalent to the food needs of 100 million people. So 100 million people is definitely not a small number. That's a very hard amount of production to make up, and lower fertilizer use will inevitably weigh on the food production and the quality of the food. So yeah, this is not a good sign. Just looking back in 2020, as the pandemic enters the third year, more households are having to cut down on the quantity and quality of food they consume. Around 2.4 billion people lacked access to adequate food in 2020, up 320 million from the year before. Inflation rose about 80% of the emerging market economies last year, with roughly a third seeing double-digit food inflation. So obviously the US did not see double digits. We did not see 10% or higher food inflation last year, but if we're actually following suit behind these sort of leading indicators of inflation, that's very well a possibility for 2022 that food prices could continue to go up. And yeah, this just gives an example of diammonium phosphate. A commonly used phosphate fertilizer costs $745 per metric ton in December, and more than double its 2020 average price. December prices for Eastern European urea, a widely exported nitrogen fertilizer, were nearly 4 times the 2020 average. So basically, if you look at all the different kinds of fertilizers that can be used, they are all going up in price. Now, the reason for this really has to do with energy prices going up. Energy is a major input, if not the most major input into fertilizer production, because basically all of these synthetic fertilizers are being produced with resources such as natural gas. So major fertilizer producers in response to this, including China, Turkey, Egypt, and Russia, have also curbed their exports in the second half of 2021, which has further pushed up global food prices. Now looking at a chief executive of CF Industries based in Illinois, he has stated that the company has only reopened 1 or 2 UK plants it closed in September, citing high natural gas prices and low availability of truck drivers. Plants in North America, where gas prices are lower, are running at maximum capacity. Of course, this ties in with a fire that is currently going on at the Weaver fertilizer plant in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It's not a good sign. Obviously, this is just kind of a drop in the bucket in comparison with all the other factors I've already talked about, but it just shows that this is not a good development in terms of trying to alleviate this supply chain issue. And now to tie in with China, China seems to always be knowing what could be coming up next. Obviously, China is very dependent on the United States and other countries for food, so they're actually hoarding over half of the world's grain right now, which of course is pushing up global prices in grains. China is maintaining its food stockpiles at a historically high level. Qin Huyan, I have no idea how to pronounce that, head of grain reserves at the National Food and Strategic Reserves Administration, told reporters in November. Our wheat stockpiles can meet demand for 1.5 years. There is no problem whatsoever about the supply of food. He might not be telling the entire truth there in that last sentence, but I guess this does show that China at least does think that food is going to be a major point of concern for them, and so to prevent any sort of or potential problems with that, or at least to mitigate potential problems with their food supply, because they really are not capable of growing all of their food in Asia just with how many people there are in China. They are hoarding a lot of food, and That has obviously put some pressure on food prices for other countries, but I think it does show that China does see something out there that maybe the majority of other countries might not be planning for as well. Now, this does tie in with just the mindset that inflation can become in people's minds. And once food does begin to really increase in prices, people begin noticing, hey, bread is costing significantly more than it did just a few months ago, or eggs or meat or whatever sort of staples they might be. This does kind of build in people's minds that, hey, if inflation is, in food is going to be 15% this year, then in a way, stockpiling at home a bunch of grains might not be a bad idea. It actually could be a very good investment, kind of an investment at that point, because you're essentially just buying things in advance that would be costing more later, when in the stock market, it might be a little harder to find yield like that. So this does get into a very slippery area in terms of inflation, in that once prices such as food begin getting into this arena where people begin noticing these price increases, it can just lead to much more massive price increases, resulting as people begin to buy more and more in anticipation of higher prices. So inflation is a very sticky kind of issue once it does finally get going, which I think unfortunately we are beginning to see. So all of that being said, this really ties in with everything I was hoping to talk about today on this channel, just how sticky of a situation we are currently in with the supply chain crisis, how that is likely not going to resolve anytime soon. And if you like this video, just give it a thumbs up. It lets YouTube know that you liked hearing my content. If you want to hear more, just consider subscribing to this channel. Feel free to leave your comments in the comment section down below, and I hope to see you again at some point.